It only feels like yesterday since Persona 5 released worldwide. The latest entry in the long-running collection of spin-offs to Shin Megami Tensei very quickly became the big fish in the little pond over the last 10 years. Since then, it's comfortably eclipsed the mainline series in terms of sales and star power, not to mention receiving a few spin-off titles of their own. While most of them have been relegated to genres like rhythm or fighting, this year marks a new release, and the first time it has ventured back into the action RPG space since Raido Kuzunoha vs. the Soulless Army back on the PlayStation 2. Produced by Omega Force, the team best known for establishing the Musou genre, Persona 5 Strikers is en route for Nintendo Switch, PC, Sony PS4, and PS5 via backwards compatibility. Though is it worth jumping back into the adventures of the Phantom Thieves? Well, let's jump right into it and find out, shall we? Persona 5 Strikers serves as a direct sequel and follows several months after the events of Persona 5, as the main protagonist returns to Café LeBlanc for the summer holidays. While the Phantom Thieves meet back up and reminisce about their past exploits, a new smartphone app takes Japan's metro regions by storm over the course of Joker's absence. Coined with the name Emma, this program doubles as a digital assistant and social media solution where users can befriend celebrities, artists, and influencers by using keywords to follow them. It's not long before the Phantom Thieves find themselves whisked back into the metaverse using Emma, where a unique keyword sends them to the physical manifestation of the subject's rotten motivations and desires known as a jail, with the leader referred to as the Monarch. Now you're probably thinking, this sounds identical to the palaces found in the original game, and for the most part you'd be right, despite Persona 5 Strikers opting for similar lexicon and working slightly different in the gameplay department. In order to bring the Monarch back to their senses in the real world, the Phantom Thieves must take back their desires in the metaverse and face their shadow selves head on, which doesn't seem too far removed from the events of the original game. What's most interesting is that a lot of the story and narrative elements land quite well. Particularly, the Monarchs feel better written than most of the palace owners in the original Persona 5. While each character is initially positioned to antagonize the Phantom Thieves, short glimpses into their past and observable behavior colors their motive and reasoning for their unique brand of malevolence. Rather than being irredeemably evil, the game paints each character in the cast as susceptible to corruption as they are to positive change. There are admittedly a few strange lapses in dialogue quality near the start, where the game attempts to establish some unearned nostalgia with players. For example, Morgana will try to reminisce with the protagonist about the time you made lockpicks at your desk, despite being only 6 months after the events of the original game, or implying that the crew can't really think or act for themselves without glorious leader Joker, but aside from that, once the game gets going it improves significantly. It helps that the game takes place in varied certain pockets of Japan rather than being exclusively within Tokyo, and after some time it develops into a quaint road trip where the Phantom Thieves explore regions like Sendai, Sapporo, and so on. It's light in tone, but it escalates appropriately as the game progresses, and with the setting change, allows the game a little more breathing room and separates itself from the events of the original game quite quickly. While I wouldn't go as far to say it is a self-contained plot, as you still need to know some Persona 5 specific terminology and jargon, it is far enough removed to be its own adventure sooner rather than later. As for the visuals, it's a great facsimile of the Persona 5 aesthetic. The UI and transitions between menus are vibrant and unconventional, but well designed, so it's quite difficult to get lost or distracted. The Switch version understandably has some slight dithering and lower resolution problems due to the power difference between other consoles, but the footage you're looking at now is the PS4 version running on a PlayStation 5. Even for the slight power bump, the PS4 version still has some obvious object pop-in and some weird character model rendering where the shading can look a little bit funny at times depending on the monitor or TV you're using, but it's not enough to be too big an issue. On the flip side, there's some really nice environmental textures, reflective wet spots, and the game handles a good amount of enemy numbers and particle effects on screen at once, so on a technical level it's still impressive, but just in a different way to what you'd normally expect. But enough of that guff, we all know what you came here for, so let's talk gameplay. As loosely mentioned earlier in the review, Persona 5 Strikers is developed by Omega Force, who have been particularly busy producing Musou-style games using intellectual property from other companies. While Musou is characterized as action games where you fight an unrealistically large number of enemies at once, Persona 5 Strikers feels a little more inclined towards action RPG territory rather than completely embracing the Musou tradition. And sure, there are lots of enemies on screen to defeat, attacks have lots of range, and most mechanics distinctive of the genre are there. For example, Showtime moves are high damage, wide hitbox screen clearing stand-ins for Musou attacks, sub-bosses resemble fights with captains, and the procedure in which combos are performed, the list goes on. Despite this, there are a few distinguishing features that allows the game to separate itself from its contemporaries, such as the ability to pause the action and utilize personas to cast offensive and defensive skills. Not only does this give the game an identity of its own, but the action has a tendency to get a little overwhelming at times, and with this, provides a great avenue for players to be aware of their position in a fight and assess enemy weaknesses. Like other Persona games, the ability to fuse Persona is retained, and while a sizable few have not made a return in Persona 5 Strikers, the ones that remain feel like almost like a greatest hits compilation of Persona, which accounts for a good, varied amount of elements and types. Speaking of, Persona 5 Strikers incorporates a lot of elemental play into its combat design, where exploiting enemy weaknesses opens up a wide range of different options, such as one more follow-ups, crowd clearing all-out attacks, or party switching baton passes to use a more effective attack type. To allow for enemy ambushes and added mobility, there are environmental hotspots that party members can latch onto to attack enemies from above, or even to run away if the action gets too intense. As you go through the game, there's a good amount of visual and statistical tells within the environment, as well as the enemy types, to allow players to keep their party composition on point, ensuring that you're always appealing to enemy weaknesses and also accounting for your own. For example, fighting enemies pervious to fire in a jail may hint that an upcoming sub-boss may swing the same way, so it encourages planning ahead. Now, around here is where I feel things get the most divisive, and where players might feel that Persona 5 Strikers is best treated as an action RPG, rather than as a whole Musou hybrid. For instance, getting the highest rating offensive and defensive equipment is nowhere near enough to excel at the game, and if you play it exclusively like a character action game, you'll find you're gonna get your butt handed to you every time. Bosses and enemies have a habit of hit-stunning you into oblivion, particularly when you factor in status ailments like brainwash and shock. However, if you play the game like you've played every other Persona title, such as making sure that you fuse and you level up your personas procedurally as you go, and as well as hoarding as many items as you possibly can, and exploiting every elemental weakness you can, you'll find the difficulty ease up significantly. Now, the previous point might seem a little discouraging, especially when most of the action in Persona 5 Strikers happens in real time, but it's a good thing that the game gives you plenty of tools to work with to offset its RPG workings. Being able to dash, perform mid-air combat, and zip between environmental hotspots makes the combat feel really fun and flighty. Common encounters with enemies don't particularly last too long, and that's reflected in the life-based combos available to the player. Rather, the game encourages experimentation with combat abilities and modifiers unique to each party member. For example, Ann can imbue her whip with fire and deal elemental damage, Ryuji can charge his pole swings, Yusuke can counter enemy attacks, and newcomer Sophia can temporarily buff herself by timing her base attacks in a rhythmic fashion, and the list goes on. There are some pretty annoying problems, mostly due to the camera, where the lock-on system tends to freak out, quite consistently too, especially when fighting agile enemies, and the camera reset function often struggles to keep up with the action, so be prepared to eat a couple of unfair attacks that you otherwise could have easily avoided. Though for once in my life, if I were to be incredibly nitpicky, I wish the baton passes felt a little less disjointed and momentum breaking, and a little more like a seamless character switch similar to what you'd find in games like Warriors Orochi, so you can cancel attacks and immediately follow up with a new character and combo in your party. Another thing I'm having a weird time coming to terms with is that while there are some very good narrative beats in Persona 5 Strikers, the curious nature of the Persona 5 spin-off games is throwing me off a little. Without spoiling too much, Persona 4 and its subsequent games made sense as they were all canonical as well as chronological, while on the other hand, Atlus seems to be having a real hard time figuring out what they want to do with the Persona 5 universe, as some of its additions feel a little haphazardly inconsequential to the series' overarching plot. Persona 5 Strikers is an interesting turning point, with it being a direct sequel to Persona 5, rather than Persona 5 Royal, and whether or not we see a retcon in the future, split timelines, or some other inconceivable explanation as to why Atlus are going this direction, one thing's for certain, it doesn't feel as focused as some of the supporting media for Persona 3 and 4. And it all comes down to what you want to get out of the series. If you just want really inconsequential, self-contained adventures, then that's great. Persona 5 Strikers is really good for that. Though if you're looking for something more meaningful and a universe with a stronger sense of permanence, well... Look, I admit, maybe I'm being overly cynical. It could be as easy as an explanation as it was developed in tandem with vanilla Persona 5, and this is just a standalone, but thinking about the bigger picture and what Persona 5 Strikers represents on the narrative level is a little bit weird. Thankfully, the rest of the game lands pretty well across the board. Aside from a few camera problems, the game is very fun in motion, just as long as you're playing it like a Persona RPG as much as you are an action game. It looks the part, sounds as energetic and snappy as you'd expect Persona 5 to be at this point, and the critical path takes around 40 to 50 hours to complete. If you're a Musou fan, you might be a little discouraged that its post-game content isn't as plentiful as its contemporaries, nor does it completely translate or lean into a Persona 5 branded power fantasy. However, if you're willing to step a little out of your comfort zone, you'll find a neat road trip adventure to sink your teeth into. For more Persona 5 goodness, be sure to like this video and subscribe, as our beginner's guide for Persona 5 Strikers drops later this week. This was Matt from New Game Plus TV. Thank you for watching, and remember, take your time.